Welcome back to this final lecture in the series of understanding carbon footprints. This is a short video and the agenda is clear. It is about reporting the greenhouse gases for industry. In the last four videos, we talked about very specific things about carbon footprint. In the first video, let me summarize it a bit. In the first video, I talked about the relevance of calculating carbon footprint, especially in the context of Paris climate change negotiations. In this second video, we talked about the calculation of carbon footprint for a family, and we showed how this estimation of carbon footprint for a family goes in a big way in reducing the carbon footprint for a family. The next video was a more technical kind of video in the sense that it talked about estimation of emission factors, and that emission factors we used for both the calculation of carbon footprint for a family household as well as for calculation of carbon footprint for an industry. In the fourth video in the series, we specifically talked about greenhouse gas emissions for an industrial setup, and we also discussed a new concept called as carbon dioxide equivalent. In this short video, we would just summarize how this carbon footprint audit is done for an industry, what things are to be kept in mind when you do the data collection and finally write the report. So when we talk about measuring the carbon footprint for an industry, we need to define first the boundaries and the scope, because defining the boundaries would help us to identify the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 type of emissions. So we talked about scope 1 emissions, we talked about scope 2 and scope 3 emissions when we discussed the carbon footprint calculations for an industry. So it is very important for us to define the boundaries and report those boundaries when you write a report about a carbon footprint for an industry. The second equally important thing is about the base year, because deciding the base year is critical, because when you are quantifying a carbon footprint and if you want to talk about improvements, especially reduction in the carbon footprint, then we need to have certain reference point, and that reference point is the base year. That helps us in quantifying and then showing the improvements which the industry would have by making suitable interventions. Interventions could be in the form of improving the energy management as well as taking very radical measures. We need to analyze all the available data for all the emission sources within the boundary and what kind of data is required. So as we discussed, we need to talk about the electricity which is consumed. That electricity data is easily available using the electricity bills, right? Or one can keep a track about the meter readings which are installed at the factory place. A very crucial data is about transport, because transport matters a lot in the carbon footprint calculations. So we need to be very careful in getting the data from the logbook, okay, about the fuel use, the kilometers traveled, the mileage of the various vehicles, and report accordingly. The other fuels, for example, the furnace oil fuels in an industry, or a biomass fuel in a biomass fuel, fired boiler, all this fuel consumption data would be available from the logbook. The sales data, sales department is very crucial department, and that should give us the data about the products, and the purchase data would also be required, especially on the raw material side. Once you get a very reliable data, then the task is half done. We need to then apply the emission factors. The emission factors are discussed in detail. Apply those emission factors and then arrive at the carbon footprint. When you write a report about the organizational or company carbon footprint, we need to start that report by first writing a description of that organization and defining the organizational boundaries. As discussed, we need to be very specific about the base year and then the reporting period. We need to include the calculations, the detailed calculations of the emissions data of scope 1 as well as scope 2. It is not mandatory to include the emissions data from scope 3 for industries as of now, but that could also be included to track the reduction in the carbon footprint which the industry would have. The emissions profile over time has to be pictorially represented as well as given in the tabular form. And then finally, the report should end with the strategy of tackling this issue of greenhouse gas emissions, how one has to, what is the scenario presently, and how do one go about introducing the greenhouse gas management. So this strategy has to be outlined clearly when you finish this carbon footprint report. So that completes this entire discussion on the carbon footprint calculations and reporting completes this course. Before ending this course, I would just point out the paradox this mankind is encountering today, and it would be incorrect to simply rely on the technical discussion which we had when we talked about the climate change and carbon footprint. So what is this paradox? This paradox which has been pointed out by observers is that we are experiencing, we as human beings are experiencing hot climates, and these are unusually hot because of the fossil fuel consumption based lifestyles. And what are those lifestyles? The fossil fuel based consumption lifestyles means we are using air conditioners, we are using transport vehicles, personal transport, luxury cars, we are using refrigerated products, right? And all this is causing hot climates. Now, in order to counter the hot climates, what do we do? To counter the hot climates, we consume more fossil fuels. How do we consume more fossil fuels? Because when the climates are hotter, we again install air conditioners, we power our air conditioners, we operate the install air conditioners for more number of days. We fly to colder climates. Okay, fly to colder climates so that we in fact we fly to away from the hotter climates. And when you fly to colder climates, it means that we are taking to air travels, or we might take to train travel, and all this is energy guzzling kind of transport equipment, transport modes, and that would contribute to a carbon footprint. And we consume refrigerated products. So all these efforts to escape away from heat, right, in turn increases the fossil fuel consumption. When it increases the fossil fuel consumption, it adds to the carbon footprint. And when it adds to the carbon footprint, it again makes the climate hotter. Now, this paradox, if you want to address, we need to do more rather than simply calculate the carbon footprint. We need to act such that the carbon footprint is reduced. If this is the broader objective of floating this course, I hope that if all of us calculate the carbon footprint for our families, for our friends, and for the industries in which we are working, and if we do a campaign of sorts to reduce the carbon footprint, then we might help this planet, save this planet from the imminent danger of climate change. Thank you very much. Bye for now.